In today's podcast, we're going to look at 4 leadership trends for 2023 that Fast Company has identified from their study, and I will provide my reflections and observations based on what I'm seeing within teams and organizations in the world we're living in today. Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced the best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back, breathe in good oxygen, and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. Hey everybody, it's Jason, and welcome back to the Thermostat Podcast, wherever you are and however you are experiencing the podcast today. Welcome back. So glad you are here. We are in Season 7, and it is hard to believe that we've already recorded over 160 episodes, 160. So thank you to everyone who's been a part of this journey from day one, or if you're new to the podcast, then welcome, and I invite you to go back and listen to some of the past episodes because there's so many great people that have joined this podcast and conversation, but also some micro pods of some good content and nuggets that I think you will enjoy for your own personal journey. I have a favor to ask of you before we get into today's topic. If you will do me the quick favor, if you will subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, if you will rate the podcast 5 stars on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. And if you'll leave an authentic review, your own words about why the podcast resonates with you, those are 3 quick ways that it helps this message spread and also for people to be able to find the podcast quicker and reach more and more people, which is ultimately the goal, to spread these positive messages around the world. So if you'll do that for me, that would be very much appreciated. If you're in a even more sharing mood, then I would encourage you and invite you to pick out your favorite episodes and share them on social media or with your colleagues or whatever's authentic for you to help introduce people to this conversation and bring them into the fold. So I appreciate you taking the time. Anybody that's willing to do that, thank you. I appreciate that more than you know. I want with this podcast, this to be continued to be a spot for you in your own leadership and culture journey. One of the gifts perhaps that I can give to the listeners of this podcast, who I know are very, very busy, is that I know everyone doesn't have enough time to read all of the wonderful articles and content that's out there in the world today. I certainly don't either, but from time to time, I want to highlight some articles and their themes that provide, some things that I think we all ought to be thinking about as it relates to leadership and culture in the world today, but also provide my own reflections and observations on the content and trends in the world of developing leaders and cultures. So, on today's podcast, we're going to look at 4 leadership trends for 2023 that Fast Company has identified from their study, and I will provide my reflections and observations based on what I'm seeing within teams and organizations in the world we're living in today. But before we dive into today's topic, let's pause, take a quick break, and we'll be right back. If you haven't done so already, we hope you'll visit Amazon or Amplify or jasonvbarger.com to check out Breathing Oxygen, my new book that is all about breathing good oxygen into ourselves and mindsets that fuel ourselves and the teams and the organizations around us. Positive, healthy thinking is as essential to great leadership and building a winning culture as the air we breathe. Leading yourself and a team of people has never been more complicated than it is today. As a leader, every move you make is either breathing life into your organization or slowly killing it. The atmosphere can easily turn toxic with negativity, blame, and doubt poisoning the culture. Just like every being on the planet needs good air to breathe, every organization needs leadership that breathes life into its people to sustain the energy required to complete its mission. Breathing Oxygen focuses on 6 key leadership mindsets that breathe life into any team: clarity, inclusivity, mental agility, grit, rest, and ownership. Join us, read, and share Breathing Oxygen.
Available now from Amplify Books on Amazon and jasonvbarger.com.
So on today's podcast, we're focusing on the 4 leadership trends for 2023 that Fast Company has identified. And these are the 4 trends that they have identified coming into 2023. Of course, these aren't the only trends and all the foundational stuff that you hear me talking about all the time on this podcast is still as important and relevant as ever. But here are 4 trends that Fast Company identified coming into 2023, leadership trends that we ought to have on our radar. And I'm going to provide my observations and reflections on these. The first one is what they call your workplace is on the hook for well-being. Your workplace is on the hook for well-being. Number 2 that we're going to talk about is what they call it's time to focus on a new kind of safety. It's time to focus on a new kind of safety. Number 3 that we're going to talk about, they call don't just respect differences, design for them. And number 4, what they call we're all still in recovery. So I'll go into more explanation about these and provide my insights and observations and quick reflections on each one of these. If you want to read the article in its entirety, of course, check the show notes and we'll put that in there for you. I'm going to add in one last one to those based on my observations that I'll just call, if you didn't think developing leaders and culture was important before 2020, you now do or should. So we'll talk about that as well on today's podcast. So let's start with the first one that they called your workplace is on the hook for well-being. So in 2023, when we think about leadership trends, they are identifying that your workplace is on the hook for well-being. And the way I'll start this off is by saying that if we truly care about our employees, if we truly care about our team members, other humans in the world, our places of work need to continue to expand the vision for how we care for our people. I've been on the record, if you're a listener of this podcast, then you know this. I've been on the record saying this for some time now, that all the challenges we've been facing in the world, that it's our places of employment, our organizations, where we spend such significant amounts of our time in our lives. It's these places, our places of employment, our organization. These are the cultures that I believe can have the biggest impact on, our lives and our perspective on contributing to the culture with the people around us. We have a great opportunity within our organizations to help people navigate, help to develop them, help create cultures that help us navigate the challenges that we're experiencing outside of our workplaces. So, not to mention, if you didn't catch that, this news in October, the Surgeon General for the United States came out and identified that toxic work cultures are having a terrible impact on people's physical and mental health. Let that sink in for a second. The Surgeon General of our country came out and identified that workplace cultures are having a terrible impact on people's physical and mental health. This has been identified as a health concern in our country. So a trend for 2023, and obviously always before this, but certainly moving forward, leaders and cultures are going to need to be as proactive as ever with identifying, in my words, what I would call, what are those toxic behaviors or structures that we are, quote unquote, again, my words, allowing to linger. Again, if you've listened to past podcasts, you know that language. You can check out episodes that I talk about this idea of in culture shaping, what we allow lingers and what we teach triggers. So we have to get better as leaders and cultures about identifying what are those toxic behaviors or structures that are allowing to linger, so that then we can identify what are the habits, the behaviors, the structures that we need to teach differently to trigger a different and more positive chain reaction. So I've worked with and I've watched Many leaders right now that are stepping back to reflect on their own proactive strategies to engage the minds and hearts of their workforce and thinking about creative ways in meetings, in retreats, in all-hands events, and also thinking about their policies on time off, sabbaticals, physical health support, mental health support, working environments, coaching and mentoring support, all of these strategic ways to say that well-being is a part of healthy cultures and leadership. And that's going to be a trend that we're going to continue to need to focus on in the coming year and beyond, of course. The second one that Fast Company identified is what they called, it's time to focus on a new kind of safety. What I'll say about this is that we know that physical safety for our employees will always be critical, of course. That's always going to be top of mind and critical to us. But with so much that's been changing around us, so much change that's happening in our economy and our world, and shifting challenges and obstacles, helping people experience psychological safety will be key. Not just physical safety, but psychological safety. In times of high stress and anxiety, many cultures turn inward. That's just what we do typically as humans, is oftentimes we retreat, we avoid, we turn inward. And what this can tend to lead to in our cultures and in our teams is that people end up keeping to themselves. And this creates an environment where they're not sharing ideas, they're not sharing their feelings, or they're not, presenting any courageous ideas that will actually help challenge the status quo in the midst of the challenges and obstacles we're facing. So, in the year of 2023, to focus on this kind of psychological safety, the best leaders, teams, and organizations will cultivate cultures where people can share openly their ideas, their feelings, and their hopes for the future. And people with opposing views aren't just squashed or punished. They're actually encouraged to, hey, let's have some healthy dialogue on things that we're feeling, seeing, experiencing, things we think could be different. And then not in the spirit of pulling away from each other or just pointing the fingers at who's to blame, but then together, eventually, as teams in a psychologically safe environment, then we need to find an aligned path forward. We can't shy away from having the courageous conversations, but then identifying after them, okay, how are we going to move forward? People need to feel psychologically safe in order to even be able to speak up and to share. And all of the progress that's in front of us is on the other side of creating these kind of environments where courageous dialogue and alignment and vision and then action for the future can rise, can be identified, and together we can all come to that. So those kind of leaders, those kind of cultures that are thinking this way are going to navigate their way through these times even more effectively than others. The third one, strategy or trend that they talk about is don't just respect differences, design for them. And what they talk about is that most organizational people strategies are built on the idea that employees are relatively the same when it comes to how they see the world or what motivates them. It's easier to generalize in this way. Yet we also know that neuroscience shows every person's brain processes the world slightly differently. If you've done any even personality assessments, I do that with a lot of different teams, and or thinking about the way that we all come to the same problem but from different perspectives, then we start to understand that neuroscience tells us this, that each of our brains processes the world uniquely. Even identical twins can have radically different neurological responses to the same experience. That's because while our genes determine how our brain is largely organized and where our neurons should be placed, environments and experiences throughout our life shapes how we act. The result is that no two brains are exactly alike. So the broad term for this feature is neurodiversity. Neurodiversity. So while neurodiversity can also refer to people with significantly different cognitive abilities, such as folks who might be on the autism spectrum, and we don't want to downplay the importance of accessibility for people with different needs. In fact, we want to highlight that and really lean into that. There's a bigger issue that's relevant to every company and every employee. Everyone's brain processes information differently. So in our cultures, in a workplace setting, understanding and accepting neurodiversity has huge implications across a variety of organizational practices, from recruiting, from onboarding, to performance reviews, to day-to-day communication. That's why it's so important for organizations to respect these cognitive differences and ensure their ways of working are accessible to everyone's mind. Now, that just means, again, we're not going to be perfect, but we have to step back and to think about how can we provide things differently or be attractive to different ways of thinking. One way to do this is to weave in more autonomy into the processes. So take onboarding, for example. Some people might do best reading documents for 5 days straight, while others might want to meet with a mentor once a week or have as many conversations with teammates as possible. Some people, based on an introverted brain, really need time to dissect the information and sit with it. Others, an extrovert, are going to really need to engage with it in a more verbal kind of manner, typically. So rather than having the same process for everyone or guessing what people might need, give people options. And also, as we get to better understand our people, we'll be able to tailor those processes and those pathways for the people. So think of it as kind of a choose-your-own-adventure for different brain types within your organization. And the key is to have a strategy for the onboard, using onboarding and again as an example, for what are those checkpoints? What are those guideposts? What are those times along the way that we're going to help think about how different brains may need to interact with the content or with the culture? The fourth trend that they talk about in 2023 is what they call we're all still in recovery. And this is a topic that I've talked about with a lot of the teams and organizations that I support. And the fact is that I'll be Captain Obvious here for a second, that over the past 3 years, we know this. We've all experienced intense collective experiences. A global pandemic, that we never imagined and threatened our safety in ways that we never thought about. Repeated episodes of police violence, school shootings, and intense issues of systematic racism, a war in Ukraine, insurrection on the U.S. Capitol, and anything else you might have been experiencing, by the way, in your own personal life. We know that divorces have been up, alcohol and drug abuse has been up, and mental health concerns all have gone up. We have experienced collective trauma as humans, as people, and that carries with us into our organizations. What this means in the workplace is that we all must understand how our needs as leaders, as employees, and humans may be different in a entire, this kind of post-traumatic context. What may be a reaction, to a relatively recent event could be entirely different than a reaction to a repeated or extended trauma. We know this. In fact, research also shows us that when recovering from collective trauma, we actually are hyper-vigilant to any possible threat around us, and that those reactions fluctuate similar in microclimates. So just like it can be raining and 10 degrees cooler in one part of town and then sunny and warmer only 5 miles away, reactions to various events and conversations can vary based on the topic at hand and who's involved. So think about that across your ecosystem of your team, your organization, that what one person might be experiencing could be totally different based on the trauma that they've had. All leaders and cultures need to use high levels of emotional intelligence to be aware of what their people might be experiencing. Of course, we can't know everything and we can't solve everything, but our awareness is going to help people recover and help us navigate our way forward. So we're going to need to practice high levels of emotional intelligence to be aware of what our people might be experiencing and how to help them navigate their way forward and feel supported along the way. And the last trend, at least observation for today, that I will throw out there as my own. And this is what I called, if you didn't think developing leaders and culture was important before 2020, you now do, or you should. This has been my experience with many of the teams and organizations, the companies that come to me. What I'm seeing is, again, if you didn't think that developing people and culture was critical to your strategy, to your effectiveness moving forward, you certainly now do. In the complexities of the world that we're leading in and how we're trying to rally people in a world where so many people have quit jobs and are looking for more meaning in their life, simply that. You have to know that it's as important as ever. So do you have a strategy? Or are you just crossing your fingers and hoping your people and culture develop in the ways that you want? Is there an actual strategy, a partnership, a connection to go do that? We need to design, we need to connect, and then we need to lead our people into that newly created future that we have together. So my observation is the best leaders, teams, and organizations are thinking this way and realizing they need that people and culture strategy. What are we going to proactively do to develop the minds and the actions of our people and our culture? So I hope today's episode got you thinking in many ways. I hope you'll think about, if you need some questions to ponder, how is your workplace handling well-being? What are you doing in terms of psychological safety? What are you doing in terms of psychological safety and creating that, cultivating that kind of environment? How are you designing your processes for different types of brains and ways of thinking? And how are you being realistic about the fact that we're all still in recovery and helping people navigate through that post-traumatic events that we've all experienced? And lastly, do you have a strategy for how you're developing leaders and culture on your team and in your organization? I hope today's episode got you thinking. If a deeper dive into any of these topics is interesting to you, I hope you'll let us know. Reach out to us, info@jasonvbarger.com, and let us know your thoughts or any topics that you want a deeper dive into. And we'll continue to design content to help meet you where you are. Lastly, I hope you'll go back and listen to a number of past episodes and search for ones that might add value to you. Cheers to the path ahead of us on 2023 and the road ahead. And remember that the future of leadership is you, is me, is us. We need to get clear on the temperature that we hope to set and then be courageous and committed to breathing oxygen into the mindsets and actions that will sustain us on our path forward. Step back. Remember, be a thermostat and breathe good oxygen. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using, and share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, the spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to you and your organization, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com, jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we are all ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.